What is the quest for the historical Jesus? And how should we think about it? Now, that phrase right there, the quest for the historical Jesus. The historical Jesus in itself has some assumptions underlying it. Generally, as this plays out, the assumption is that the Jesus of history is different fundamentally from the Christ of faith. So there was the flesh and blood Jesus who walked around in the first century, um, you know, teaching in Galilee and talking about stuff and, crucified, all of that. And then there's the Christ of faith, this sort of later Jesus who existed in the minds of the early Christians. And what we have in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels, is we have the earliest Christians sort of retroactively reading their later understanding of Jesus into these traditions so that the Gospels do not tell us, um, they're not, these pure historical accounts of Jesus of Nazareth. Uh, Rather, they represent the theological interests of the early Christians, um, pumped through the stories about Jesus, as it were, so that the Gospels might tell us much more about what the early Christians thought about Jesus than who Jesus actually was. The thought here is that the Jesus of history is sort of buried behind the early church's interpretation of Jesus. And so, what we get when we read the Gospels, we just get their interpretation. Like we are not really accessing the real thing. And on one level, I mean, there's no such thing as an event or something happening that is uninterpreted in its presentation, right? If I tell you about, the Thursday night football game that happened this week, uh, my account of it will necessarily be selective. I might highlight certain players over others. The broadcasting station that I watched it on and um, the plays that they chose to give instant replay to, that will influence how I understand it and then present it to you. And so on one level, when we read the Gospels, sure, we are not in the historical sense directly encountering this uninterpreted, objectively true Jesus. Fine. But the sort of suppositions of the quest for the historical Jesus says that um, we need to get behind the dogma of the theology of the church, strip all that away so we can get closer to something of the real historical Jesus himself. Today we're going to talk about the quest for the historical Jesus, the different quests that have been involved in that, and some of the major players in that game. The first major player we need to talk about is a scholar named Hermann Samuel Reimarus. Now, he was a German philosopher. He lived in the 1700s. He was a scholar. It was not until after his death that some fragments of his work were published by a scholar named Lessing. Reimarus was highly skeptical that the Gospels were at all representative of the life of Jesus. Reimarus, in his works that were not, again, published until after his death, he basically said, the miracles in the Gospels didn't happen, the resurrection didn't happen, the disciples of Jesus stole his body and then told everybody that, there was this resurrection, he had been raised from the dead afterward. And G.E. Lessing publishes this, and, it's an explosion. This is the first work of its kind in Europe. This gave rise to a number of scholars who followed in this broad tradition, what we can call the first quest of the historical Jesus that was kicked off by Reimarus. Another scholar who is interesting, H.E.G. Paulus, he essentially believed, similar to Reimarus in a lot of ways. When he told the story of Jesus' resurrection and he tried to reconstruct it, he said that Jesus was essentially in a coma and he was laid in a cold tomb, and then he woke up. He was just mistakenly dead. He was in a coma. And he's also famously um, said that Jesus walking on the water in the Gospels, that something like that event really did happen, but that what actually was going on is that Jesus was just walking on a sandbar that was not quite visible for the disciples. Another scholar in the first quest, D.F. Strauss, he did not think that the Gospels were reliable historical sources, but he did think they contained like good theological and philosophical truth, so that we still really need the message of the Gospels. But as far as the historical events themselves, Strauss would say, no, these are not reliable accounts of history. We also get William Vrede. He is famous for producing a book called The Messianic Secret, the German original Das Messias Geheimnis. Vrede is looking at these, what he calls secrecy injunctions in the Gospels, where Jesus will heal somebody or cast out a demon, and then he will tell people not to tell anybody, or he will silence the demons from talking about who he is. And Vrede reads this, and he reads this as the early church's attempt to read back into the story uh, why Jesus never really claimed to be the Messiah in the first place. Like, Vrede's historical account is that Jesus didn't claim to be the Messiah. That's like the early church's theological view, retroactively placed back onto Jesus. And these secrecy injunctions in the Gospels, these are later added by the evangelists or traditions that they inherited. And these are the early church trying to make sense of why so many people didn't think of Jesus as a messianic figure during his lifetime. Um, Historically, Vrede would say it's because Jesus didn't claim it. But these later Christians who did believe Jesus was the Messiah, they have to sort of rewrite the story to make sense of that. So they add these secrecy injunctions in. And Vrede is very famous for this messianic secrecy motif. You get others. Adolf von Harnack was another prominent one. All these figures, they have different emphases, but they're all in this first quest, essentially saying that the Jesus of history is fundamentally different from the Christ of faith. And we can, have some historical reconstruction, but we really need to dig behind. There's the analogy of the kernel and the husk. We have to peel back the husk, the theological husk, to get to the historical kernel that's laying inside. So it's about stripping away these layers that are actually just the early church's theological ideas, so that we can get to this sort of historical core. Next, in the early 20th century, this figure named Albert Schweitzer comes along. And Schweitzer is a fascinating figure. He was a New Testament scholar. He also had a doctorate of medicine. Um, and he went on to go be a medical missionary to Africa. He was also an expert on Bach, like the musician. He was a fantastic organ player. He was truly a Renaissance man, about as famous as any scholar in the world at the time. Mark Goodacre, who teaches currently at Duke, he has a great podcast episode talking about Albert Schweitzer, and I'll link that in the description. But in 1906, Schweitzer releases a book. The German original title is Von Reimarus zu Vrede, and this is from Reimarus, remember Hermann Samuel Reimarus, to Vrede. So from Reimarus all the way to William Vrede. And he's sort of tracing the history of this quest for the historical Jesus. Um, but what Schweitzer does, he has blistering criticism of these 19th century scholars trying to uncover the historical Jesus. What Vrede essentially says is, he says, you guys are all reconstructing Jesus from the Gospels, and what always happens is that you create Jesus in your image. The historical reconstruction of Jesus you guys come up with always happens to look exactly like you. This Jesus ends up looking like a nice post-Enlightenment rationalist, very European liberal Protestant Jesus, which coincidentally is what all of these scholars were, right? Um, Schweitzer looks at this quest for the historical Jesus so far, this what we'll call the first quest. And he says, you guys are doing nothing more than making Jesus in your own image, right? Whatever values you really hold ethically in the contemporary world, it is really easy for you to find them in Jesus, even if the Jesus of history never cared about any of these things. George Torrell is another scholar of the time, And he criticized Adolf von Harnack, one of these historical Jesus scholars, and said, essentially, you guys, you look down the well of history. You're looking down this well of history to find the historical Jesus. And what you always see is yourself staring back, right? This is scathing criticism of the quest so far. Schweitzer, though, he did, set forth his own sort of reconstruction of the historical Jesus. And very aware of these scholars who came before him, who always imposed their own, 20th century values back onto Jesus. Schweitzer was very okay with Jesus being totally unlike the Christian movement that followed him. In Schweitzer's reconstruction, Jesus was this crazy end of the world prophet who believed that the eschaton, the end of all things, was coming, and that he was sort of ushering the way for all of this to happen, and that the Son of Man was going to come. Importantly for Schweitzer, he doesn't think that Jesus believed that he himself was the Son of Man, but that he was sort of preparing the way for the Son of Man. So, an important verse for Schweitzer, he looks to Matthew 10:23 when Jesus sends out the disciples on this mission to Israel. And Jesus tells the disciples that you will not get through all of the towns, all of these places in Israel before the Son of Man returns, right? Like Jesus believes, according to Schweitzer, that this Son of Man figure, who is not Jesus, is going to come and usher in the end of the world while the disciples are out on their sort of prophetic mission to Israel. And Jesus is clear that this is going to happen before these disciples even finish up their mission. Well, the Son of Man doesn't come, right? The disciples do finish up their mission. And so Jesus sort of has this turning point in his own understanding of what's going on. I mean, he's disappointed. He's, tragically mistaken that this Son of Man did not actually come when he thought he would. And so Jesus ultimately sees, as Schweitzer reconstructs it, um, he sees that this didn't actually happen. He sort of takes the fate of history on himself. He is crushed by the movement of history at his crucifixion, and he dies a complete failure. Right? For Schweitzer, Jesus is he's a total failure. He was wrong about this end of the world thing. But Schweitzer, because he's looking back on these, German Lutheran liberal theologians, he does not want to impose sort of later church dogma on Jesus, and he's fine with Jesus being really foreign to later Christian tradition. And so Albert Schweitzer, even though he does not think Jesus is ultimately somebody worth imitating in that sense, he thinks Jesus was essentially wrong about everything he predicted and believed. Schweitzer is interesting because he still goes on this medical missionary stuff, and Schweitzer, preaches and writes these very impressive works of New Testament scholarship. Schweitzer's criticism of the first quest of the historical Jesus is so devastating to the project at this point that he really stops the entire thing in its tracks for a while. I mean, there are still people doing this, but his criticism about people creating Jesus in their own image, that has a really big impact on the field. And it introduces a time period, what scholars often now refer to as the no quest. So you have the first quest and then the no quest. And in this time, one of the dominant figures is Rudolf Bultmann. Bultmann wants to demythologize the New Testament. He is extremely pessimistic about, what sort of historical truth we can glean from the Gospels and these stories about Jesus. Bultmann would say maybe that the entire project of the quest for the historical Jesus is itself mistaken because the early Christians have so profoundly imposed their own theological systems onto these lives of Jesus, the Gospels, that it's just not accessible for us. Like we cannot access the historical Jesus because their own interpretation is so strong in these presentations of his life. So there's a time period there. Bultmann, Karl Barth is also, I mean, he's not a historical Jesus scholar, but he's very much in this lane that we should focus on God's revelation rather than on history itself. Ultimately, though, out the other side of this, we do get now a second quest for the historical Jesus. So first quest, no quest, which was stamped out. First one was by Schweitzer, and then no quest. We think historically Rudolf Bultmann is really important there. Finally, we get the second quest for the historical Jesus. And if you're counting here, this is really like the third quest because the no quest is kind of the second quest. But here, one scholar who's really important and kind of kicks this off is Ernst Käsemann. Now, Käsemann was a student of Rudolf Bultmann. Remember, Rudolf Bultmann, major figure in the No Quest. But Käsemann had very strong criticisms of Bultmann and his sort of theories about how we should approach this whole thing. Käsemann believed that, because we call Jesus like the crucified one, um, like things like that prove that the Christian message is sort of inextricably linked with history, right? Like we can't totally divorce history and later dogma. They might be two different things, but they're not separable totally, right? This second quest doesn't pick up a ton of steam. He here we get things like the criterion of double dissimilarity, and so this is a way to try to figure out if a saying of Jesus is authentic. So the criterion of double dissimilarity sort of posits that a saying is probably more likely to be historically accurate if it doesn't just sound like, some other Jewish teacher in the ancient world. So if Jesus says something and he sounds really unique from the Jewish teachers of his time, that's probably more likely to be accurate than if he sounds a lot like the Jewish teachers of his time, because, that could just be being made up. There are tons of problems here with the criterion of double dissimilarity. First, Judaism is not one sort of uniform thing in the ancient world, similar to the way that Christianity is not just one uniform thing today, right? If I were to ask, what do Christians believe about the Lord's Supper? You'd have to ask, like, what denomination or what sect? In a similar way, Judaism in the ancient world was not monolithic. There were varying beliefs about all kinds of things. There were different sects who had different stances um, on scripture, on messianic expectations, on eschatology, on Torah observance, whatever these issues are. I mean, Jews did not just believe one thing about this. You can't just flatten that out. So to say that we should prioritize sayings where Jesus does not sound like a Jewish teacher, that's actually really hard because what is the quintessential Jewish teacher of Jesus' time? It's not that simple. A second criticism of this criterion of double dissimilarity is that it divorces Jesus from his first century Jewish context, right? Like if this is the criterion, what we end up with is a Jesus who just looks nothing like ancient Judaism's. Um, and again, the sort of temptation here is that sort of the way Schweitzer criticized the first quest, Jesus just ends up looking a lot like us with these kind of criteria. We strip him out of his first century Jewish context and make him unintelligible in that world. So that's another great criticism of this quest. Maybe the most public facing part of the quest for the historical Jesus, a group called the Jesus Seminar gathered together. And this was a group made up of both scholars and non-scholars. And they would gather together from time to time, and they had media publicity and stuff. And they would gather together and they would take sayings of Jesus or deeds of Jesus from early sources, and they would essentially vote on, is this authentic or not? They had a system of beads, which is really funny. They had 4 different color beads. So they had red beads. If somebody read out a saying from Jesus, say, love your enemy as yourself. If you thought that Jesus really believed that, or Jesus really did say this saying, you would put out your red bead for that saying. Um, so red is very confidently believe. Pink indicates that you believe that, maybe these aren't the exact words of Jesus, but Jesus probably said something like this. So red, pink, gray beads You don't think Jesus said what is in the passage, but it's related to Jesus's ideas, sure. And then finally, black beads. You put forward a black bead if you believe that Jesus did not say this passage. This comes from some other later tradition. This does not come from Jesus at all. And so this group would meet and they would vote on sayings of Jesus by putting forward their beads. Their main sources were the Gospel of Thomas, this apocryphal gospel, and Q, which Q is material that is shared by Matthew and Luke, but does not appear in Mark. And there are problems with Q. I personally don't think Q exists. But they would vote on sayings from Q and the Gospel of Thomas. Richard Burridge, who is a New Testament scholar, he would later write about um, Greco-Roman biographies and if that's what the Gospels are, and he would say yes. Burridge has this amazing critique of of the of the Jesus seminar. Burridge writes, this group, produced a Jesus who was not Jewish in his teaching, but he was more like a Greek wisdom teacher or philosopher. He's against sexism, imperialism, and all the oppressiveness of the Roman Empire. Burridge says, in other words, he's a Californian. He's somebody from California, right? I mean, over and over again, we run into this problem where people trying to reconstruct who the historical Jesus was, he just ends up sounding a whole lot like us, or like we hope that he would be. The second quest overall, fairly disappointing, has been rightly criticized by its detractors. Finally, the most recent quest, the third quest for the historical Jesus, um, this this quest really swings apart from the second quest, which de-emphasized the Jewishness of Jesus. The third quest really tries to contextualize Jesus within his Jewish world. And in particular, it tries to understand Jesus within Jewish eschatological expectations. This includes figures like N.T. Wright, E.P. Sanders, Martin Hengel, John Meyer. These scholars try to understand Jesus, the historical Jesus, within Judaism in order to, sort of make sense of what is historically reliable. The thought here is that, of course, Jesus is um, a Jewish thinker and a Jewish teacher. We need to be in tune with the other conversations that are going on in order to understand him intelligibly in his world. So we've got the first quest, kicked off by Reimarus, these European thinkers who make Jesus look a lot like a liberal Protestant. We have the no quest, think Albert Schweitzer, his criticisms of the first quest. We have the second quest, Ernst Käsemann, Jesus Seminar, that kind of thing. And we have the fourth quest, this quest for the Jewish Jesus, N.T. Wright, E.P. Sanders, these kinds of figures. These are the quests for the historical Jesus within the larger quest. Currently in scholarship, I mean, historical Jesus studies still does happen. I mean, it is a field, a subdiscipline within New Testament studies. I think what we've seen in recent years is that people are interested in the gospel writers as theologically interested authors. So, what is primarily interesting to scholars is not, does Mark get this scene historically right, or what can I learn historically about Jesus from the text? But more questions like, Mark tells this story about Jesus in this particular way. Why does Mark, as an author, as an early Jesus follower, why does Mark or John or Luke or whoever, why do they tell it this way? And what did they believe about Jesus? Rather than, accessing the Jesus of history, which some have just thrown up their hands and say, that's not possible. The quest is misguided as a whole. There's a tendency, I think, for scholars to be more interested in trying to uncover what these earliest Christians actually believed about Jesus, because that in itself is a fairly complicated question. So this was just a quick overview of the historical Jesus, the quest for the historical Jesus, and some of the sort of major players over the last 200 years or so in these quests for the historical Jesus. I'll be interested to see over the next few decades if, where other trends lead, what sort of things people become interested in what sort of currents people follow, what the next quest will be, if there is one. But this stuff is interesting. Asking questions about how can we peel back the layers of the Gospels to extract historical truth about Jesus under certain suppositions that we may or may not disagree with. And we might think the quest for the historical Jesus and its methods are invalid for other reasons. And we can talk about those too. But for this conversation, I just wanted to introduce us to the sort of history of scholarship here and some of the ideas that have been going on. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it.